So yes, this is the second of the four noble truths, and the first noble truth is that unsatisfactoriness or suffering exists. But I just wanted to open with a quote, indeed from my son when he was in the top of primary school, so probably aged about 10. And they were studying Buddhism at primary school. And he came back one day from school and he said, "God, you're depressing, you Buddhists. All you talk about is suffering." And they've been studying the Four Noble Truths at primary school. And so I embarked on this very clear and succinct explanation of why the Four Noble Truths was such a positive and liberating teaching, but I'd completely lost him before I got halfway through the first sentence. So I'm hoping that your staying power is better than his. Anyway, you're more of a captive audience, or certainly probably more polite, so that's good. So the second noble truth is that there is a cause of suffering. There is a reason for a reason why life can feel unsatisfactory, why we might experience. We often use unsatisfactoriness as the translation of dukkha, but it can also be translated as suffering, or just a sense that something's wrong. And so the second noble truth is that there is a reason for that. And when I was thinking about this and pitching it, particularly obviously to quite a mixed group, I was thinking, well, that's a bit of a challenge to spend whatever time I have talking about why we're suffering. But actually, what it is it's incredibly radical. So what the Buddha found, and in his own experience, and what he taught as the first thing that he taught, as the Four Noble Truths, is that he discovered there is a reason why we suffer. There is a reason why life feels unsatisfactory, or we're not always content, or we feel ill at ease at times. And that's incredibly radical. And it's also really positive, because it's not like, oh, so that's just the way things are. That's what it is to be a human being. Tough. There is a cause of it. And therefore, there is also, we will find out in November and December in the talks for the third and fourth Noble Truth, there is also an end to it and a way to end it. So it's incredibly, but obviously what I'm focusing on here is the second Noble Truth, that there is a reason why life feels that way. I mean, and broadly, the reason why, as the Buddha discovered all those years ago, is the human condition. It's how we respond to the reality of how things are. It's sort of, it's us as human beings, it's us as conditioned beings in the world, and how we have evolved. But that, it's the human condition. It's not our fault, so that's good news. But there is a way to end it. There is something to do about it, which is also good news. So that's why I find it really positive. So when we say, well, yeah, it's the human condition, I'm going to unpack that a bit and use various different examples from my experience as well. And one of the things in terms of unpacking that is that we need to be really clear about the difference between pain and suffering. I'm going to use the word suffering in this. It's the translation of dukkha, unsatisfactoriness or suffering. And we need to be really clear about the difference between pain and suffering when we're talking about the Four Noble Truths, and really the essence of a lot of Buddhism. So pain, both physical pain and indeed emotional pain, is necessary. It gives us information. It gives us crucial information. It tells us that something is wrong. We can't get rid of that, and we're not looking to, and nor are we looking to avoid feeling anything. We're not trying to be wrapped in cotton wool in some bland, it's all okayness either. Rather, in terms of the Buddhist life, what we're looking to do is often, to be fully present in our lives, and to be able to respond helpfully, appropriately to whatever arises, to respond authentically, compassionately. I mean, the compassion, that has the word passion within it. We're not looking for something soft and bland. And actually, our own suffering gets in the way of that, paradoxically. It gets in the way of a response that is authentic and positive and natural and helpful to whatever's arising in our own experience and also with others. And it's that suffering, that what gets in the way, that is referred to in the second noble truth. Those of you who've been around a while, and also people who've done mindfulness courses, will probably have heard of the Buddha's teaching on the 2 arrows, which I'll just mention briefly, because it's just a really, really clear exposition of this difference between pain and suffering. And the Buddha taught that when something happens to us, whether it's an internal thought or something physical, or reading a email that isn't that's not that is possibly quite horrid, or whatever it is, we're struck by 2 arrows. One is what actually happens, and that is the aspect of pain. That's the thing we can't really do anything about. This is happening, this has happened. And the second arrow is everything that we then can bring to that, the things that we add to that. So, one of the really most simple examples that I often use is, sitting in meditation, and I feel, might feel a twinge in my right knee. So that's information, maybe I need to move, maybe I need to, that's pain, it's information. So that's the first arrow. The second arrow is if I then go into a spin of, oh, that's it, I'm never going to be able to sit and, I'm getting too old, I'm not going to be able to sit and meditate on the floor anymore, I'm going to be on a chair, or I'm never going to be able to walk, or, it's all of that. That's what we add. So that's a really sort of, in a way, quite a sort of simple example of it. In my own experience, a slightly more complex example is that I get migraines, and more or less regularly through my life, and I have a wide variety of responses to having a migraine, and one of which is to medicate the pain away and carry on as normal. Another one is medicate the pain away but adjust. but also I have lots of experience of, for example, recently I was away for a weekend and I didn't have the medication with me. And I spent the whole weekend, because it's usually sort of 2 or 3 days, I spent the whole weekend going through different responses and exploring them. So there was pain physically throughout the whole of that weekend. But at times I was just lying there. It's just like, well, I can't do anything else. It was quite peaceful. I was just aware of, the rest of my body. The pain is a fairly, one aspect of other bits of experience. So there's physical pain, but I wasn't suffering. I was quite content. I could just lie there and relax, and other times, I was railing against it, or I was I have a whole narrative about, but I've been practicing for more than 30 years. I've been meditating. I shouldn't be feeling this. I should have gone beyond it. I should be able to not do it. So, and that obviously is a state of much more suffering than just the migraine. So, and you might, I haven't, I had, which I probably will have, if you've heard me talk, may have heard me mention this. I had long COVID for 2 years up until a few months ago, and that was, I became acutely aware there, because I had to do a lot of lying about and listening to my body, that, a headache, the first signs of a headache was definitely the sign I was doing too much. I had to immediately stop, lie down, relax. And I became much more able to relate to headaches and now migraines as, in a way, my minder and my friend. It's like, in a way, when I look back at my life, my conditioning is to do lots. If it wasn't for that, I probably would never have stopped. It's like once a month, lie down for a couple of days, So I became, it's just reframing it and things. So it's not, I haven't sussed it. I go in and out of it, but it's an area in which I can explore that difference between pain and suffering. And that's physical pain, and that's a message. But we also, although it can be less clear, we also need our emotional pain. to indicate that something is wrong, that maybe we've disconnected from other people, we've disconnected from ourselves, from our values. You know, the work we're doing, you know, is not according to our values, that we're not in connection with nature. You know, so again, that emotional pain is information. It's necessary information about what we need, you know, what we may, you know, how we may need to adjust our lives if we have the ability to do that. You know, and in a way, well, oh, were it so simple, you know, that would be great, wouldn't it? If we just like, okay, I need to adjust, something's wrong. You know, if it was just information, that would be fairly simple. But obviously, all too often, our thoughts and our feelings will spiral up or spiral down. You know, we maybe, you know, go down into a depression or a nihilism, or spiraling down or up into anxiety and or anger or anything. I mean, we will all have our particular favorites when it comes to the tendencies we have to add to what's happening. And we can really get locked into states that are quite unskillful for ourselves, or and we may or may not recognize that we're suffering. We may not, that's not, maybe not how it feels. Some of them can feel quite positive for a while, and I'll come on to that. But then we might be causing hurt to other people, causing suffering around us without, you know, just through how we are. So this can all be quite acute or subtle. It can be quite chronic, or just it also, there's lots and lots of different flavors, and we'll all have our own particular favorites. But I wanted to mention a couple that I've explored quite a lot, because I think they're quite common. I mean, one of them is well, within Triratna particularly, we tend to term these sort of righteous indignation and horrified anxiety. They're two very, very strong forms of suffering, of what we're adding to it, what can happen when we're adding to experience. And they were both ones that I ended up exploring quite a lot on. I did a 3-month retreat in 2019, so nearly 4 years ago. And these were just things that came up. I'll a bit, but and one of them, so the sort of the righteous indignation. I mean, they were both really bizarre experiences, because it was several weeks into a retreat that was in silence. It was a led retreat in Wales, and in silence. And I was mostly, you know, quite quickly in quite a peaceful state, and my mind was quite quiet. But with both of these things, what happened is that they sort of suddenly arose as states of mind. You know, like with the righteous indignation is very much a felt sense. We can feel like, they shouldn't be doing that. That's typically what it is. Well, they shouldn't be doing that. And it can feel quite sort of, it's that the felt sense of it is quite puffed up. And I just went into an entire spiral of this out of the blue on this retreat. And it was largely around really petty things like, for heaven's sake, there's a shelf to put slippers on before you go into the shrine room. Why is everybody scattering them around the door like this? You know, those sorts of states of mind. This is like completely petty in the middle of something quite deep. But what it was that what I really, and it went on, it was only, you know, probably was only 2 or 3 days, but it was a real opportunity to sort of, you know, for a while, you know, sorry, just backtrack a bit. What we can do when these things arise, you know, quite simply, one is we can try and alleviate them. So we might look at it, well, what does that feel like in the body? Breathe, distract yourself, move away from those thought processes. But because I had, you know, I was on this long retreat, I thought, well, that's interesting. So you can also just engage with them in a way, looking directly at these things from more of an insight perspective and thinking, so what's going on? What's happening? And just noticing these sorts of thoughts and feelings spiraling and this sort of puffed upness and things. And after a while of noticing this and it just attaching to lots of different things, some petty, some sort of memories from the past, something in me, you know, just looking at this said, that's not serving you. This isn't helpful. And it really dropped, that sort of thing. It was just like, yeah, that's really not helpful. And it dropped, and this was obviously in a particular context. And since then, when I get into that, I mean, it can still arise, but it quite quickly is seen for, yeah, it's not that helpful. Let's not go there. And I tend not to. It's a particular, I mean, there's obviously lots of flavors we can go into, but that's one that I tend not to spiral into anymore. And then something quite similar happened with anxiety, horrified anxiety and shock. It was just like I was remembering newspaper articles or news stories about people behaving really horribly to other people, sometimes to children or whatever. And so it was it was shock and horror, just and this sense of really wanting to close down against it, and what's happening. And this went on for probably wasn't that long, probably only 2 or 3 days again, but lots of things just coming up. And again, I chose not to sort of try and calm my mind and move away from them, but rather to look directly at it and see, okay, so what's really happening? And it's quite interesting really because especially it's thinking about, people behaving really badly, quite cruelly. But what that sort of then pointed to was, in a way, part of the sort of nature of the human condition that causes suffering. As the Buddha saw, that it's the sort of the human condition that causes suffering, and part of that is this sense that we have evolved and been conditioned to believe that we're sort of a separate human being, to believe we're separate from everything. So Buddhism teaches that everything is a sort of interconnected flow of arisings and passings. Things just arise, change, pass. Nothing's fixed, nothing's permanent, nothing's sort of graspable. And that includes, me. I'm just the product of conditions arising in this moment, doing this, that'll change. But because we have evolved through no fault of our own, this is not a fault thing, but it's an interesting thing to look at, to believe that, here I am, a separate human being, and I need to survive. That survival instinct is very strong. And in order to survive, or in order to thrive, I need to move away from or push away anything that I think threatens me, anything that I don't like, which might even just be difference, people that I'm not familiar with or things I'm not familiar with. And I need to pull towards me or even amass and build up things that I feel shore me up or protect me or keep me safe in different ways. So this belief in a sort of separate existence, a separate me, is very vulnerable. It's not an easy place to be. And it's illustrated by the center of the wheel of life, if you've ever come across that as an illustration in Buddhism. And at the center of the wheel of life are greed, hatred, and delusion, illustrated by a pig and a cock and a snake. And it is that sense of the greed, which is okay, I need this, you want to hold on to things that shore us up. And this pushing away, the hatred, pushing away what we don't want. And at the center of that, this illusion, this delusion that we are separate, that we need to protect ourselves. And we can sort of see where that leads on a macro level as well. It's not just about us or different aspects of ourselves, but it's also, all of the people around us. And unfortunately, those running the world and making really quite big decisions that affect us, will also be conditioned human beings that are driven in this way, and applying that to the need to survive as a nation or as a country or whatever it is. And obviously, we can see all around us the effects of that. And we can look at it in ourselves, but it's what's interesting is that, with the space to look at that and particularly this, seeing it, that, what I was seeing in that sort of few days of focusing on horrified anxiety was all of that manifesting, in the hatred, the greed, the all that sort of need to shore up, need to protect, manifesting in in ways that were very, very harmful indeed, sort of outside of my normal experience, way outside of my normal experience. But actually then sort of just having that, looking at it directly and being able to experience it, again, something really dropped, because it's like, well, so what do we expect? It's like the horrified anxiety is shock. It's shock at the way people can behave. But actually, when you really look at it and think, well, this is, we are conditioned with this belief, and that is going to play out in all sorts of ways, particularly for people who have had, difficult starts in life, difficult upbringings, are in very challenging conditions, are in conditions where resources genuinely are scarce and there's a need to compete for them. What do we expect? It is going to happen. It is, and there's something about that sort of really dropped the horror or the closeness, and could give rise to a much more compassionate response, because it's just like, well, of course, this is going to happen. Most of us probably have some, in a way, the fortune and the privilege to have been raised in ways and have access to resources where we don't need, we're unlikely to behave in really extreme ways. But it's not surprising that does happen because of this belief in the separate self, when people are in difficult conditions. So again, that sense of horrified anxiety in response to that really dropped. And again, it's sometimes when I hear things, it'll be like, how? And it's just like, well, yeah, we know how. We know what the condition is. And this is what the Buddha saw so clearly. It is this sort of the human condition that leads to suffering. And we can change it. That's, I don't want to preempt talk number 3 of Third Noble Truth next month, but it's, we can change it. We can free ourselves of it. We can alleviate it, and we can also completely free ourselves of this suffering that's based around this belief. I'm just going to pull back now to a slightly more sort of everyday experience of it as well, because we can, another way that we add this layer of suffering to experience, just as I say, not by fault, but just by humanness, is that we can also just get stuck in a narrative. That sometimes, you might have, again, we'll have our own particular favorites. A couple of mine are, about being too busy, or more recently actually about being isolated in some of my views. But I just talk about the one about being busy, because objectively, by most accounts, or compared to a lot of people, I do a lot of things. I mean, not as much as I used to, particularly, because of having had long COVID for 2 years, I scaled down. But actually, I do a lot of things, well, because people ask me to, and I think, oh yeah, that's interesting. Oh yes, I could do that. Oh yeah, I could help there. So it's, and actually I'm very privileged. I'm very fortunate. I find the things that I do meaningful and useful, and I don't have to do things mostly. I mean, obviously we all do lots of mundane things as well, but mostly I'm very, very fortunate. And if I'm sleeping okay and keeping myself physically well, then it's no problem. You just go from one thing to the other and it's fine. But I can get into this narrative of it's, and you can hear other people do it, oh, I'm so busy, oh, it's really stressful, oh, it's really difficult. And actually being in that narrative and saying it to ourselves and to other people just adds weight. It's just like, oh yeah. You can feel yourself almost descending under the weight of it. So there is, there are again ways we can alleviate some of these things, by reframing some of these narratives. I banned the word busy from my vocabulary a few years ago. I'm not allowed to say that in response to, how are you? Oh, busy. Don't do it anymore, because I found it wasn't very, very helpful. But and actually, when I can get into that narrative, maybe I sort of need to, be in nature, swim in the pond, have a bath and an early night, cuddle up in front of the TV. It's quite basic things, and it can be okay. So yes, so in any moment, this is just the sort of the last bit really, and then there will be time. Be interested to hear any thoughts or questions afterwards. But yeah, so in any moment, what is real from a Buddhist perspective, from a sort of ultimate perspective, is what's arising through the senses, the sense, and what we can feel in our bodies, what we can taste, smell, or touch is the feel, but also hear and see. And within Buddhism as well, the mind is a sense, and mind is heart mind, so that includes the awareness of thoughts and emotions, feelings. So that's what's happening in any given moment, is what's arising. And then our thoughts join the dots. They draw on past experience. Oh yeah, I recognize that's happening, that. So we can just make sense of all of that sense experience. And that's necessary. We need it to make sense of the world and navigate it. But, and also thought can be very advanced. It can be very helpful when we need to think. It's really, really useful. But the trouble is that thought can go into overdrive. It can completely take over, and we can lose sight of the fact that we're thinking, that the thoughts are adding up experience, that we can get lost in a narrative. And particularly when things aren't okay, maybe when there's a sense of unsatisfactoriness, I'm not sure what's going on, our thoughts can go into overdrive, and they can create entire worlds. Yeah, they're looking at me because they think there's that, and before you know where you are, you're lost in this entire world where, unfortunately, people aren't being very nice to you, so you need to be not very nice back, or whatever it is. But the whole sort of world, and that is what the Buddha is pointing to in the second noble truth, is all of that. So you can sort of whip it up into quite a big thing, or it can be quite subtle. But whatever it is, we're missing the beauty and poignancy of the moment that we're actually in, and we may be living in a fearful future scenario. So what this second noble truth is pointing to is that the more that we can be aligned with reality, this reality of change, of flow, of being interconnected rather than separate, and that includes being with things that are painful, whether they're physically painful or emotionally painful. There are things that will have that response, and we're not trying to not feel. There may well be things where you think, oh, but it's a softer, more useful, more compassionate response than that sort of, oh no. But so the more that we can just notice, be with things as they are, accepting the reality of what's happening, the more that we can free ourselves from all these added layers that not only cause us to feel trapped and to feel suffering at different levels, whether quite subtle or quite strong, or get trapped in a state of suffering, but that also just cuts us off from others, cuts us off from an authentic, skillful response to what's happening. So it's just this sort of added layers. That's what the Buddha's talking about when the second noble truth of there is a cause of suffering, and it's all this added layers of stuff, of reaction. And it can feel bad to us, but it can also prevent us being able to respond meaningfully, authentically, helpfully to other people. So that is what the Buddha saw when he and what he was talking about in that first teaching, is that there is a cause of suffering at whatever level, and it's not our fault. We're born this way, we're conditioned this way, we grow this way. It's not our fault that it's there, and yet we can do something about it. We can alleviate it gradually, and we can